Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has brushed off accusations from Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu that he's a weak politician who has betrayed Israel. The comments were made after Australia's decision to move towards recognising a Palestinian state. Albanese insisted Israel must put an end to what he called the cycle of violence.
I don't take these things personally. I engage with people. Diplomatically, he's had similar things to say about other leaders. What I say is that Israel, of course, increasingly there is global concern. And global concern because people want to see an end to the cycle of violence that we have seen for far too long. Democratic Western nations have said very clearly that the idea that you would just occupy Gaza city and continue to do more of the same in the same way, just as Prime Minister Netanyahu said more than a year ago when we had a discussion. It was very similar. You just can't keep doing the same thing.
Well, for more, let's bring in Antony Loewenstein. He's the author of The Palestine Laboratory, a book about Israel's arms and surveillance industry. He joins us from Sydney in Australia. Thanks very much for being with us here once again. As we've seen, the UK, France, Canada are also planning to recognise a Palestinian state. So why in particular is Netanyahu lashing out at Australia? Or is this more about the rhetoric that Albanese has been using?
I think a lot of this really is theatre. I'm not suggesting there's not some diplomatic crisis between Australia and Israel. There clearly is. There's not a lot of love lost between Albanese, our Prime Minister, and Israel. But what is important to note for viewers to understand, throughout this entire process since October 7, and frankly started before then, Australia has continued to trade with Israel. It sends and sells hundreds of millions of dollars of things, items, coal, etc. It still sells Australia weapons parts as part of the global supply chain for the F-35 fighter jet that Israel uses over Gaza. This has continued. None of this has stopped. So a lot of the growing public outrage, there was a massive public protest in Sydney a few weeks ago, about 300,000 people. People were angry that the Australian government talks that they're upset. They're incredibly concerned, like the language rhetorically increases, but there's little action. So I suspect in this latest case, you have a situation where some of the more hardline, frankly, far-right, racist, pro-Israel lobby groups, wouldn't surprise me, have lobbied the Israeli government to attack the Albanese government in the deluded hope that that somehow will show that the Israeli government is tough. The opinion of the Israeli government here within Australia, like most Western countries, is in the toilet. They're deeply loathed for good reasons.
Yeah, like you say, 22 months into this war, it does seem like there's been a huge change in sentiment towards Israel's actions in Gaza. 300,000 people crossing the Sydney Harbour Bridge in protest. Why do you think that is? What has changed? Why now?
I think a lot of it is to do with the fact that there is bipartisan support in Australia. So that both major parties support Israel largely uncritically. As I said, rhetorically they're different, but the policy remains remarkably similar. And people are seeing these horrific images of genocide every day on their phones, on their computers, on their televisions, every day, day in, day out. And I think people also really are aware of the gross hypocrisy of, for example, within a matter of days, after Putin and Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, Australia's putting on massive sanctions, targeting Russian businesses, Russian oligarchs. None of that has happened here with Israel. And people see that hypocrisy. It's pretty obvious, even the way the media often reports it here. Donald Trump meets Vladimir Putin a few days ago, the way Putin is framed as a war criminal, which he clearly is. But yet the language often that's used, particularly by the Murdoch press here, the Murdoch press is incredibly influential and although less than they used to be, they still frame it as if somehow, oh my God, can you believe it? The Israeli government is upset. Not really reading the room. The room says that a lot of Australians are angry with what is going on and the fact Australia continues to send weapons parts and trade with Israel. Just briefly, there's a trade office in Canberra, in our nation's capital, and in Tel Aviv. This is an attempt to try to increase trade between Israel and Australia. None of that has stopped or slowed down. And people are aware of that and they're angry.
Yeah, like you mentioned, I mean, there is a substantial Jewish community in Australia. Do you think that this marginalises them, that Netanyahu's saying that they have been abandoned by the Australian government?
Well, the question is, which Jews? I mean, I'm Jewish, and I can assure you that I don't feel abandoned by my Australian government. I'm not a fan of the Albanese government for a range of reasons, but I don't feel abandoned by them over this. What you've had in the last 24 hours is very revealing. The most prominent far-right, racist, so-called mainstream Jewish lobby groups came out, said they were concerned about the deterioration of relationship between Israel and Australia, not because they have any love for Albanese. They are worried that the Australian government, because of Netanyahu and his coalition's extremism, will push the Australian government to take more actions. There is a growing split in the mainstream Jewish community, as there is in the US and elsewhere, between the very so-called mainstream pro-Israel lobby who loathe Palestinians, who support the genocide in Gaza, and others, such as myself and many, many others, who support groups like the Jewish Council of Australia and others, that say, not in my name, this does not speak for us at all. And I think that civil war of sorts that's happening in the Jewish community in America, where generationally many, many, many younger Jews are disgusted by Israeli actions, whereas older generations are much more supportive.
Right.
That's starting to happen here. And it's necessary. That civil war needs to happen here, a non-violent civil war, of course, as soon as possible.
Right. Just finally and briefly, if we may, where do you think that this goes next?
Yeah.
Is there going to be more diplomatic fallout? Could we potentially see sanctions put in place?
Well, certainly there's pressure on Albanese and his government to put sanctions. I think it's conceivable that the Israeli government will escalate. They may well try to kick out the Australian ambassador in Israel, with something I would welcome. I mean, if Australia could finally kick out the Israeli ambassador, which many of us have called for a long time. Look, I think ultimately it's a similar diplomatic kabuki like we see with France and England. All those countries, despite the fact that Israel says publicly they hate their actions on recognising Palestine, have remained open with trade, are still sending weapons to Israel. So I think there needs to be growing pressure on those Western states to say, match your actions with rhetoric. And that, so far, Australia has not done, although there's pressure on Albanese to do so, as there should be.
Thank you so much, Antony. Always good to get your thoughts. Antony Loewenstein there in Sydney for us.
Thank you.